Hey, you guys, I want to talk to you about one of my favorite forms of photography, my favorite genres, which is street photography. Just so we're all clear on what street photography is, let me just read you this definition from Wikipedia. Street photography is photography conducted for the art of inquiry, which means you're inquiring into something, that features unmediated, which means nothing between you and your subject. There's no direction going on. Unmediated chance encounters with random incidents within public places. Street photography does not necessitate the presence of a street. I was going to answer that question in the video, or even the urban environment. Though people are usually featured directly, street photography might be absent of people and can be an object or environment, where it goes on, sort of complicated way of saying it can be stuff that relates to people. That's what street photography is all about. I like it because that's where the world is. The world is outside and it's not posed. It's not necessarily set up. And this is funny because it kind of goes against what I was talking about in my last video about how you have to get out there and direct. Well, you still do. You're directing yourself in this case. So some examples of street photography from my books. There's all kinds of, this would be considered street photography. Even though there's no people in it, it's certainly a human environment, right? And again, I do most of my photography is out and about. Now, would this be considered street photography? It's an animal in the street in her environment. I would kind of classify this as natural street photography. Tell me what you think. And then, I've shown you my work from Mexico. This is definitely street photography out and about in the environment where these people live. And these were shot really just by engaging with them. And that's probably a question that you might have. Do you talk to people beforehand, or do you just get out there with your camera and shoot? And the answer is yes. It's actually both of those things, or either one. In some cases, you do make eye contact. You do let the person know that you're shooting, and you kind of engage in that conversation with them. But many times you don't. You see them doing something, they don't even see you. And we're going to go over some examples of those too. But in these cases, obviously, I had engaged with them, and they saw me with the camera, they made a connection, and I pressed the shutter. So these are all various examples of street photography. I'll show, here's one more, which is really interesting. This is kind of stretching it as far as street photography, but it's in the mountains in Switzerland, and you see the very tiny backpackers here. After I did a lot of work with Bob Holmes, I realized that my landscapes could be more interesting if I had people in them. And I think that that's, first of all, there's this very human point of connecting with other people. But something that Bob pointed out is it gives you scale and perspective. You can see how small they are and how big the mountains are. But I think the even more important point is you connect with those people. You could be standing there. You could be climbing that mountain. And I think that's the importance of street photography. It's capturing those everyday events. What camera should you take? Well, here's what you shouldn't use for street photography. A great big DSLR like this. How come? You hold it up to your face, it's like, wow, this is pretty formidable. And it puts an enormous barrier there in terms of, what's between you and your subject. I recommend, this is my original camera for street photography. Now, if you're not shooting film, you might say, oh, this is kind of funny. I've got a Canon lens cover on it. This is a Leica M2. And this was the camera that Henri Cartier-Bresson, who to me is the ultimate master of street photography. We're going to look at some of his work in a minute. But you see what's great about it? See how small it is? You can practically fit it in the palm of your hand. I mean, you can. And that makes it go away. It makes it more invisible than that big DSLR. So what I'm going to show you is how we kind of transition into the modern world. I'm going to take this lens off. So I'm using my original Leica lens with a modern Metabones adapter. I'm going to put it on my Sony A7 R3, and voila, look at that. Isn't that cool? I have my Leica 50mm lens, my modern Sony a7R III. And if you notice, it's actually just about the same footprint, maybe even a little bit smaller. So this is a good camera for going out and shooting on the street. A 50 mil lens. You know, you're losing some of your modern stuff, like it does not have autofocus, but hey, that's cool. This is your focus, and you control your aperture and so forth. But this is a great example of a camera for street photography. Another good camera for street photography that I use all the time is an iPhone or any smartphone that you've got. Why? Because you carry it around with you all the time. And that's sort of the point of street photography, is being able to just pull out a camera at any moment and start shooting. That's super important. Another point that might come up, I'm sure it's crossed your mind, what's the legality? Do I have to go out and get signed releases from everybody? So this is a book I recommend. It's called Clearance and Copyright. And it answers every kind of legal question that you might have in terms of filming or shooting. And in here, and by the way, that's Michael C. Donaldson, a good guy who's on our side. He says, what happens when you're filming in a public place? Do you need to get a release from every person who gets in your shot? Then he goes on and he says, there is no general right to privacy for someone who is in a public place. There have been lots of cases about this. And then he cites two of the biggest cases. But here's his conclusion. The lesson is that you can shoot in public places without permission as long as you don't make affirmative misrepresentations. Affirmative means you're definitely misrepresenting somehow or another, okay? So you could figure out, well, what would that mean? A hidden camera, for instance, where you're definitely hiding things, or you're clearly just lying to people while you're shooting. So don't do that. Be straightforward, be honest. But law is on your side. However, what about the other part of it, which is if somebody doesn't want their privacy invaded and they're clearly telling you to go away, go away. Don't break through that. I was shooting in Italy, this wonderful sight of this woman with a basket on her head full of flowers. And she came up to me and I started photographing her, and she got really ticked off at me. Okay, I stopped. From a human side or an ethical side, you should determine whether or not somebody is going to allow you to break into their world. And that's just something you have to decide for yourself. If there's a very intimate moment where they're clearly trying to keep themselves out of public view, you should respect that. Another point is, how do you get inspired? What should you look for? You know, if you've read my books, you've heard Bob Holmes talking. The way I get inspired is I look at books and I go to museums. This is a fantastic book. It was actually left to me by one of my father's patients who passed away. And when I was in maybe 12, 13, I actually looked at this book quite often. It's Henri Cartier-Bresson, the master of street photography. Look at this. This is just people lounging in the summer. They're completely unaware of him. He had this way of popping in and taking a photograph and popping out. And very few of these will you see that he engaged the person or they even knew he was there. Here's an example of somebody who was aware that he was there, but you can see he's just hardly paying attention. Cartier-Bresson just had this way of sort of disappearing. And in this one, the man is completely unaware. None of these people are looking at the photographer here. He's got this window into everyday life to find the little stories. There's some story going on here that just draws you into this photograph. Just amazing. I love both of these photographs. This one's really amazing, where these kids are just reading comic books. There's some money here. There's something going on. You have these men back here that are really blown out. I mean, that's the nature of it. That's outside, and this is in the shadows here. But look at how they're just geometrically arranged and how they're super engaged with each other and not aware of the photographer at all. Okay, imagine this was just a landscape as opposed to having the dog and the horse and these two guys. And look at the geometry here. You've got the pyramid-shaped mountains. You've got this row of raised dirt here, whatever that is. the geometry of the horse's neck, the way the dog is lying there, these two men leaning diagonally against it, just a phenomenal photograph. Those are some tips, you guys. The most important thing about street photography, like all photography, is getting out there and doing it. Don't get hung up on your equipment. If you've only got one camera, well, that's your camera. Hopefully it's not something very big that gets in the way of everything. And listen, you've always got this camera that's with you all the time, and you've got your own eyes. So look, and that's the key to street photography, is really seeing what's there. Don't let things that are like amazing pass you by, because the secret of street photography is finding those moments that everybody else kind of walks by and somehow they catch your eye and you record it forever. Okay? Love having you guys with us. Remember to leave your comments, your questions, your feedback, and be sure you subscribe. And remember to get out and capture your own images of life.